everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys my 2020 series wrap up. This is an idea that I came up with last year, so I did do one for 2019 and I'll link that up in the cards above if you're interested. But essentially I'm going to be discussing all of the series that I completed in 2020. So I may or may not have started them in 2020, maybe I started them in 2019, but I read the final book in 2020. Also, I want to point out that I'm only going to be discussing series that have an interconnecting story, so I'm not going to be discussing any companion series in this video. Without further ado, let's just get into it. I'm just going to pick from the stacks of books next to me. So the first series I'm going to talk about is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. I finished my very first reread of this in February of this year actually, and I did reading vlogs for this entire series, so I will link that playlist up in the cards above if you are interested. I have very mixed feelings about this series now that I fully understand how much of a problematic person J.K. Rowling is. I don't know if I'll ever reread these books again, to be quite honest, but I really did enjoy my first reread, and there were quite a lot of things that I picked up upon reread that I didn't the first time that I read these books. And also it had been like years and years since I first read this series. So yeah, it was cool to revisit this world and the characters and all of that, but like I said, I just have very mixed feelings about this series now. Next up is a duology by a new to me author this year, and I really enjoyed this for the most part. This is the American Royals duology by Catherine McGee. So the premise of this is that this takes place in an alternate universe, I guess you could say, where the United States was created as a monarchy as opposed to a democracy. And so we are following quite a few different POVs of the royal family of the United States. And one thing I will say is that it took me a hot minute to really get immersed into this world and this story, just because it's so unbelievable to me that the United States would ever be created as a monarchy, given that we were rebelling from a monarchy. But once I kind of suspended my disbelief, I really enjoyed this. This is essentially a teen soap opera in book form. Definitely gave me vibes of Gossip Girl, 90210, things like that. So if you love soap operas especially, I think that you will really enjoy this. This first book I gave 5 stars. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. The second book, called Majesty, I enjoyed a lot. I gave that one 4 stars, but at the end of the day, I have mixed feelings about how some of the characters' arcs ended, if that makes sense. Some characters ended up with characters that I didn't want them to be with, so that was kind of odd. Next is a trilogy that definitely took me by surprise. I didn't think I was going to enjoy this as much as I did, and that is To All the Boys I Loved Before by Jenny Han. So, I mean, you guys have probably heard of this series at this point because Netflix has been adapting the books into movies, but this is essentially about our main character, Laura Jean, and she wrote these love letters to all of the crushes that she's ever had, but she put them in a hat box, and somehow these letters get sent out to these boys, and that is the big catalyst for this story. And I enjoyed these books so much more than I thought I was going to. I think mainly because I love the whole family dynamic between Laura Jean and her 2 sisters, and their dad is like the best dad ever. I just love that whole family dynamic. I also really like Peter Kay's character. I know a lot of people wanted her to end up with John Ambrose, but I found his character to be kind of bland and boring. I think the third book, Always and Forever Laura Jean, is my favorite, which is funny because I seem to be in the minority with that. A lot of people love either the first or the second book, and they like hate the third book. They just think that it shouldn't have been written, but I thought that it added a lot to the story, and I thought that it was very relatable because in that third book, Laura Jean is going through all of this college stuff. She's trying to decide where she wants to go to college. She's getting rejections, acceptances, things like that. So there's a lot going on for her that I thought was just really well done and really relatable. So I wholeheartedly recommend this trilogy if you haven't read it yet. I just think it is a really sweet and wholesome story. Next is a series that to this day I don't know how to feel about it. I'm just kind of left confused, and that is the Shatter Me series by Tahira Mafi. You will know if you saw my tier ranking of the worst books of 2020, I'll link that up in the cards above, that I didn't enjoy this upon reflection. At the time that I read these books, I was having a good time. I think I gave pretty much all of these books 4 stars. So to explain a little bit of what this is about in case you don't know, we have Juliet, and this is in a dystopian society, and she has this power where if she touches someone, she could kill them. I will say I liked the writing just because I love Tahira Mafi's writing style in general. I definitely recommend A Very Large Expanse of Sea by her, which is her only contemporary at this point, I think. But this story is so odd. I did not like Juliet, the main character, and if I don't like the main character, then like, that's not good. I did not like Warner, who was her main love interest. I thought he was very problematic and like, a girl, where's the flavor? I liked Kenji's character a lot. He's one of the main characters. I think he shows up maybe in the 2nd book, if I'm not mistaken. But other than that, I'm just left feeling very confused and like, what even was this series? Next is a spin-off series of a series that I read in 2019 that I was so excited to get to, and I enjoyed it just as much as I thought I was going to, and that is Bloodlines by Richelle Mead. So this is the spin-off series of the Vampire Academy series, and I really loved that series in 2019, and this series I think is even better. I think it's just a tad bit more sophisticated and mature. It's definitely still a YA paranormal romancy series. So this one is about Sydney Sage, who is a character that was featured in the later half of the Vampire Academy series. She's a human. She is an alchemist. Basically, alchemists are these people that basically work to keep vampires a secret from the human world. And then our other pretty major character is Adrian, who was also heavily featured in the Vampire Academy series, and the romance between Sydney and Adrian gave me everything I ever needed. I also just loved the vibe overall of this series. I think I gave the last couple books 5 stars and the other books 4 stars. It's just such a great series in my opinion, and this totally solidified for me that Richelle Mead is definitely one of my favorite paranormal authors out there. Next is a series that I started in 2019 and I completely fell head over heels in love with, but the 4th and final book was a bit of a disappointment for a lot of us, and that is The Diviners by Libba Bray. So this is a very popular series here on BookTube, and for very good reason. It's essentially a paranormal historical fiction series. It takes place in the 1920s, as you can probably tell from the Art Deco style of the cover. And our main character is Evie O'Neill. She comes to live with her uncle in New York City because her parents just don't want to deal with her anymore. She has this ability where if she holds an object, she can tell the history of that object, who owned it in the past, what their life was like, things like that. And so in this series, we discover that there are other teenagers like her that have these very interesting abilities. And each book kind of centers on a different plot. Like this first book is essentially a murder mystery. There is this ghost called Naughty John that is murdering people in very horrific and ritualistic ways. And so yeah, the 4th and final book, The King of Crows, came out in February of 2020. And I enjoyed that final book. It did go in a different direction than I wanted it to go into. I do think one of my criticisms is that I hated that the main group got so split up over the course of that 4th book. I wanted them to all stick together and like fight the good fight against the King of Crows, and that's not necessarily what happened. I also feel like the ending was maybe kind of rushed and weird, and I don't even remember anymore what happened at the very end of the book. It just did not measure up to how amazing the other 3 books in this series were. I am still very much looking forward to rereading this series at some point, just because I want to remind myself of everything that went on throughout these 4 books, and maybe my opinion of the final book will change. Next is a duology that ended up in my top 10 books of 2020. I will of course link that video up in the cards above if you're interested, but that was the Wolf by Wolf duology by Ryan Groudon. I have talked about this duology so much on my channel at this point, so I feel like I don't have much to say, but just to quickly explain to you what this is about, it's a historical fiction, science fiction duology. It speculates on the idea of what if Hitler and the Axis powers won World War II. There is this annual motorcycle race that commemorates that victory. And so our main character, Yael, is a skin shifter, and she impersonates one of the racers so that she can win the race and get close enough to Hitler to assassinate him. And something that I keep forgetting to mention in a video when I talk about this duology is that it actually gives me Hunger Games vibes. And that's because only teenagers, like I think you have to be between the age of 12 and 17 to enter this motorcycle race, and also you can only either be Japanese or German to enter this motorcycle race. So in some ways it definitely gave me Hunger Games vibes because of that, but I have raved and raved and raved about this duology at this point. Next is a series that I decided to reread in 2020, mainly because I think Netflix announced an adaptation that they're planning on doing, but I don't even know if that adaptation is happening anymore. But that is The Selection by Kiera Cass. This is technically a series of 5 books, but I have only ever read the trilogy, the original trilogy. I have no interest in reading the other 2 books because it's not even about America. Those books are about America's daughter, and I just don't care to read that. But if you don't know what this is, it's essentially The Bachelor meets The Hunger Games. We have America Singer, our main character, which, like, yes, that name is the worst. We can all agree on that. The United States has been turned into a kingdom called Ilia, I think. So she ends up getting picked from a lottery of sorts to be one of, I think, 25 girls who get sent to the palace to compete for Prince Maxon's heart. So this was my very first reread of this series. I read this in college when this came out, and I had a fun time with my reread. I gave this first book 5 stars, and I think I gave the other 2 books 4 stars. Like, it's a fun, messy, dramatic time. Definitely gives me soap opera vibes as well. So if you're here for that kind of vibe and you haven't read this yet, I would say give it a shot. Like, it's not high quality literature by any means, but like, I had a fun time. Next is one of my favorite dystopian / science fiction series of all time at this point, and that is Scythe by Neil Shusterman. So I read The Toll, which is the 3rd and final book, in January of this year. So that's why I'm talking about it in this video as opposed to last year's video. But if you don't know what this is about, we are in a world where everybody is essentially immortal because illnesses and crime have been eliminated, and you can kind of regenerate yourself to become a younger self whenever you want to, basically. So you could theoretically live forever. So in order to control the population, they have these people called scythes, and their job is to go around and kill people. It's known as gleaning, and scythes have quotas that they have to stick to. They have to kill a certain amount of people every few months. So we have our 2 main characters, Roan and Citra. They end up being apprentices under this one scythe. So that kind of gives me vibes of The Giver in that way. And I just adore this series so much. The Toll is my personal favorite book of the series, and I know I'm in the minority of that. I know a lot of people loved books 1 and 2, which is Scythe and Thunderhead, and then a lot of people gave The Toll like 3 stars because it's over 600 pages. It's definitely a slower paced book, but I just personally loved every single page of that final book. So I wholeheartedly recommend giving this book a chance if you know you enjoy dystopian novels such as The Giver, classics like that. I think that you'll get that same kind of feeling from this story as well. Next up, we have A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is a trilogy that I read all throughout 2020. I'm actually going to link my binge reading vlog playlist up in the cards above because a lot of these series that I read this year, I did reading vlogs for. So if you want to know my more in-detailed thoughts about a lot of these books, definitely check out those vlogs. But for those of you guys that don't know, this centers around the idea of there being like 4 different Londons. We have our main character, Kel, and he can travel between the different Londons. He's one of the very few people that can. He lives in Red London, which is a London that thrives off of magic. We have Grey London, which is very much like our world. There is no magic, there's just regular humans. Then we have White London, which is a magical London, but it is being torn apart through magical war. And then there is Black London, which no one speaks of anymore. You can't even go there anymore. It was destroyed by magic. I love the world that V.E. Schwab created. This first book I really enjoyed. I gave it 4 stars. Unfortunately, this series went downhill for me. I talked about this series a lot in my worst books of 2020 video as well. The second and third book just lacked so much in my opinion. Next up we have A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. I also did reading vlogs for this series if you are interested, and I feel like I'm one of the very few people that hadn't read this series at this point. This is a very, very popular, I would say, new adult fantasy series, and the first book is very, very loosely based off of Beauty and the Beast. We have our main character, Feyre. She is hunting in the woods for her family. They are very poor, and she ends up shooting and killing this wolf who turns out to be a fae. And so this guy, Tamlin, shows up in beast form, and he essentially kidnaps her. He really forces her to go with him back to Prythian, which is where he's from, which is the realm of the fae. And the plot goes on from there. This first book I gave 4 stars. I thought it was pretty boring for the most part, but books 2 and 3 were infinitely better in my opinion. And you might recall that Akamath was one of my top favorite books of the year. I just love that book so much, and I know I'm not the only one that adores that book. It's definitely a fan favorite. Next is another series that ended up in my top 10 books of 2020, and that is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I love the binge reading vlog that I did specifically for this trilogy because I just loved all of the discussions that I brought up specifically about Jude's character, who is our main character in this series. And if you don't know, this is about Jude when she was 7 years old. Basically, this fae Maddox showed up and murdered her parents right in front of her, and so he took Jude and her 2 sisters with him back to the realm of Elfame, the realm of the fae. And so now it's 10 years later, and she's just trying to survive in this very ruthless and cutthroat world of the fae, basically. We also have Prince Carden, who is the youngest son of the king of Elfame, and Jude and Carden definitely have a rivalry going on for a lot of this series, actually, and it's their hate to love story as well. And I just love this world that Holly Black created. Her interpretation of fae is so interesting to me and very unique. Next is another series that unfortunately I mentioned in my worst books of 2020, and that is the Stalking Jack the Ripper series by Carrie Maniscalco. So I read the last 2 books in January and February of this past year, and just to give you a basic synopsis, we are centered around Audrey Rose and Thomas Cresswell. This is a historical fiction murder mystery series, and they both want to go into forensics. I really enjoyed this first book, Stalking Jack the Ripper. I loved Hunting Prince Dracula. I almost gave that 5 stars, and then, like I've talked about many times on my channel at this point, I really did not like the 3rd book, Escaping from Houdini, and then Capturing the Devil was just a very blah finale. So I don't think I'll ever reread these books, but I do have very fond memories just because I love Thomas Cresswell so much. I do want to quickly mention that I loved the novella that Carrie Maniscalco wrote. I think it's called Becoming the Dark Prince. That is from Thomas's point of view. I think that that novella is just absolute perfection, and I was just loving my time being in Thomas's POV because unfortunately all of these books are in Audrey Rose's POV, so we don't get to see his side of the story a lot of the time, but that novella was perfect. So yes, I have very mixed feelings about this series as a whole. Next up we have The Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. I adored this first book, and unfortunately I was a little bit disappointed by Crooked Kingdom, which is funny because I think I'm in the minority for that as well, because I know a lot of people love Crooked Kingdom way more than Six of Crows, but me personally, I just didn't love the direction that story went in that second book, and I just feel like the villain was kind of lame. Basically have these 6 outcasts, and they come together to pull off this really crazy and pretty much impossible heist. Yeah, what can I say about this duology that hasn't already been said? I think that this book is pretty much perfect, and like I said, Crooked Kingdom, not so much, but I still enjoyed it overall, and I definitely would reread it in the future just because I just think the characters are dynamic and absolutely fantastic. And I cannot wait for the Netflix adaptation. So Netflix is adapting both the Shadow and Bone trilogy and this duology together into one show, which I think is going to be very interesting. I'm intrigued to see how they're gonna do that because those 2 stories are very different from one another. Next up we have The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I reread this for the very first time this year because The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was coming out in May. What can I say? This series was just as fantastic as it was the first time that I read it. I gave all 3 of them 5 stars. Catching Fire is still my favorite installment. It's definitely a series that I'm gonna want to reread over and over throughout my life. And last but certainly not least, we have the Illuminati Files by Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman. So I read Obsidio, which is the third and final book, in January, I believe. And this is such a cool YA science fiction thriller series. So all three of the books kind of center on different things, but there's definitely an overarching storyline. We have our two main characters, Katie and Ezra. They literally just broke up, I think right before the story starts, maybe. But they're living on this ice planet that is an illegal mining colony. And so this evil corporation called Baytek shows up with these huge spaceships and it's intent on murdering everybody on this planet. So everyone is essentially just trying to escape Baytek by getting on their own spaceships, but as if that's not enough, there's also a deadly virus that is spreading throughout one of the ships. And so yeah, it's just crazy things happening. I think Gemina, which is the second book, is my personal favorite of this trilogy. Also, if you don't know, this series has a multimedia aspect to it. We've got like IM chats. We also get the POV of Aiden, which is the AI that controls these spaceships. And Obsidio, which is the third and final book, I enjoyed that one a lot. I did give it 5 stars, but to me it was a little bit lacking compared to Illuminate and Gemina. But yes, I highly recommend this. I wholeheartedly recommend listening to the audiobook and reading the physical book at the same time, because the audiobooks has a full cast of narrators. There's all kinds of special effects, like sound effects going on in those audiobooks. Like the production is top notch, but also like the multimedia aspect of the physical novel just can't be missed in my opinion. All right guys, that's going to be it for all of the series that I finished in 2020. I would love it if you would leave a comment with the star eye emoji. I'll of course leave a picture of it over here if you got to this point in the video. I would also love it if you would tell me about some of the series that you read in 2020 and what you thought of them. I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!